3:47 a.m., Teaneck, New Jersey. The house was silent in the way expensive houses are silent. Not empty, just insulated, thick walls, heavy doors, the kind of silence money buys. Julie Lucas sat in the living room, still wearing the dress she'd put on 18 hours ago, diamonds at her throat, designer heels kicked off beside the couch, a glass of wine on the coffee table untouched for the last 2 hours. She was waiting, again. This was the part of her life that didn't appear in photographs, not the furs or the cars or the jewelry, just waiting, in beautiful rooms, for a man who came home later and later, and when he did come home, brought less and less of himself with him. The front door opened at 3:52 a.m. Julie didn't move, just listened to the familiar sounds, keys in the bowl, shoes on marble, Frank's. Footsteps approaching the living room. He appeared in the doorway and Julie saw it immediately. The blood, not a lot, just a few dark spots on his white shirt collar. He tried to cover it with his jacket, but the jacket had slipped. Frank saw her looking, saw that she'd seen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Julie asked the question, not the question she was supposed to ask, not "where were you?" or "what happened?" Not the questions wives in her position learned to never actually voice. A different question, one that had been building in her for months, maybe years. Do you still see me when you look at me, or do you just see what I cost you? The words hung in the air between them. And in the silence that followed, Julie Lucas realized that after 7 years of marriage, she'd finally asked the one question her husband couldn't answer. To understand why that question mattered, you need to understand how they got there. Not just to that living room at 3:52 a.m., but to a place where Julie had become something she didn't recognize, married to a man she wasn't sure she'd ever really known. 1963. Julie was 21, Frank was 32. They met at a club in Harlem, not one of the tourist spots. A real neighborhood place where locals came to hear good music and forget about whatever they were trying to forget about. Julie worked as a secretary in Midtown, made decent money for a young black woman in 1963, had her own apartment, her own life, her own plan. She wasn't looking for romance, certainly wasn't looking for danger, but Frank Lucas had a way of making you look at him. Not because he was loud or flashy, because he was. Still, in a room full of noise and movement and energy, Frank was centered, calm, like he knew something everyone else was still trying to figure out. He bought her a drink, they talked. He was charming in that understated way that's more effective than charm that announces itself. He asked about her work, her family, her dreams, seemed genuinely interested in her answers, didn't talk much about himself, which, at the time, Julie found intriguing. She didn't know what Frank did for a living, not specifically. He said business. When she asked what kind, he smiled and said, "The kind that keeps me busy." Red flag. Julie knew it even then. But there was something about Frank that made red flags look like interesting challenges rather than warnings to run. They started dating. Frank was attentive, thoughtful, remembered details about things she'd mentioned in passing. Sent flowers, took her to nice restaurants, always a gentleman, always respectful, and always just slightly mysterious. Julie's friends warned her, "You don't really know this man, you don't know where his money comes from, you don't know what he does all day." They were right. Julie didn't know, but she also didn't ask, because part of her liked the mystery. Liked the way Frank made her feel special without making her feel owned. Liked the excitement of being with someone who operated outside the normal rules. Red flags, if you look at them from the right angle, can look like adventure. They got married in 1963. Small ceremony, Frank's friends on one side, Julie's family on the other. Two worlds that didn't quite understand each other, coming together for a day. And pretending it was simple. The early years were good, or they seemed good. Frank was building something. Julie could feel it even if she couldn't see it. He was gone more, making connections, establishing himself. But when he was home, he was present. They talked, laughed, made plans. Julie still worked her secretarial job. Frank insisted she didn't have to, but she liked having her own money. Her own identity outside of being Frank Lucas's wife. That mattered to her. Independence had always mattered. Then Bumpy Johnson died in 1968 and everything changed. Julie didn't know Bumpy well, had met him a few times, understood he was important to Frank, a mentor, a teacher, but she didn't understand the full weight of what Bumpy's death meant until she saw how it changed her husband. Frank became more focused. More driven, more absent. He'd always been ambitious, but after Bumpy died, ambition turned into something else. Obsession. A need to prove something, to become something, to build an empire that would make Bumpy proud and make everyone else irrelevant. The money started coming in, not gradually, rapidly, like a dam had broken. New cars appeared in the driveway, new clothes in the closet. Frank bought them a house, not in Harlem, in Teaneck, New Jersey, suburbs. Lawn, neighbors who smiled politely and probably wondered what this young black couple did to afford a house like that. Julie quit her job, not because Frank demanded it, because it started to feel absurd. Why would she work 40 hours a week for what Frank made in an hour? The math didn't make sense anymore, but something else stopped making sense. To her purpose, when Julie worked, she was Julie, secretary, independent woman, person with her own schedule and responsibilities and identity. When she quit, she became Frank Lucas's wife, full-time occupation, and she wasn't quite sure what that job entailed beyond looking beautiful and not asking questions. The diamonds came next, then the furs. Frank would bring them home like gifts, and they were gifts, but they were also something else. Investments, displays. Evidence of success. Julie wore them because Frank wanted her to, because they made him feel like he'd achieved something, like he'd elevated her, elevated them both. But Julie started to notice something. When Frank looked at her now, he wasn't looking at Julie. He was looking at his work. She was proof, evidence, a showcase for what he'd built. She was becoming a symbol, and symbols don't have inner lives. The nights alone grew longer. Frank was traveling, Vietnam. He didn't talk about what he did there, but Julie knew it was important, central to whatever he was building. She'd stopped asking questions years ago, had learned that questions made Frank distant, made him see her as a liability rather than a partner. So she waited, in beautiful rooms, wearing beautiful things, being beautiful. That was her job now, and it was killing her slowly, not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly eroding the person she'd been until she wasn't quite sure who she was anymore. She tried talking to other wives, women in similar situations, married to men who operated in worlds their wives weren't allowed to fully enter. They all had the same advice: enjoy the lifestyle. Don't ask questions, be grateful. Julie tried to be grateful. She had everything most women wanted: security, luxury, status, a husband who was powerful and successful and never raised his voice to her or his hand. But she was lonely, profoundly lonely, the kind of loneliness that comes from being seen but not known, from being valued as a possession rather than a person. And then came that night, 1970, March. Frank had been gone for 3 days. Vietnam run. Julie knew better than to ask for details. She'd spent those 3 days the way she spent most days now. Shopping, lunch with other wives, maintaining the image of the perfect life. Frank was supposed to be home by midnight. Midnight came and went. Julie had learned not to worry. Frank could handle himself. Whatever he was doing, wherever he was, he knew how to survive it. But when 2 a.m. came, then 3 a.m., Julie felt something shift. Not worry exactly. Anger, because this wasn't about safety. This was about respect, or the lack of it. She sat in the living room, still dressed, still waiting, thinking about her life, really thinking about it for the first time in years. When had she stopped being Julie? When had she become this beautiful, expensive thing that waited in beautiful, expensive rooms? That's when Frank came home, 3:52 a.m., blood on his collar, exhaustion in his face. He looked at her and Julie saw him calculating, deciding what to say, what explanation would work, and that's when she realized: he thinks I'm manageable. He thinks I'm a problem that can be solved with the right words or the right gift or the right amount of money. He doesn't see me, he sees a variable to manage. The question came out before Julie fully thought it through. Do you still see me when you look at me, or do you just see what I cost you? Frank froze, literally stopped moving, because the question had hit something neither of them had acknowledged before. What? His voice was quiet, careful. Julie stood up. I'm asking if you see your wife when you look at me, or if you just see proof, evidence, something you acquired. Something that demonstrates your success. Julie, I'm not angry about the blood, Frank. I'm not angry about the late nights or the trips or the things you don't tell me. I knew who you were when I married you. I chose this. She walked closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried. But what I didn't know was that I'd disappear in the process. That being Frank Lucas's wife would erase Julie. Frank opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who always had answers, who could talk his way through any situation, negotiate any deal, solve any problem. But he couldn't answer this, because Julie was right. When he looked at her now, he saw beauty, elegance, success. He saw the diamonds he'd bought, the furs, the house, the life he'd built. He didn't see the woman who used to work as a secretary in Midtown, who had her own dreams before they got replaced by his, who was still in there somewhere, buried under all the luxury, asking to be seen. The silence stretched between them. Julie waited, gave him the chance to prove her wrong, to say something that would show he still saw her as a person rather than a possession. But Frank just stood there because he didn't know how to answer a question that exposed a truth he'd been avoiding for years. Finally, Julie nodded. "That's what I thought." She walked past him toward the stairs, paused at the bottom step. "I'll still be here, Frank. I'll still wear the diamonds, still play the role. But don't mistake my presence for partnership. We're not partners. I'm part of your collection, and we both know it now." She went upstairs, left Frank standing in the living room at 4 a.m., facing a truth he couldn't solve with money or power or strategy. Their marriage continued. On the surface, nothing changed. Julie still accompanied Frank to events, still wore the furs and the diamonds, still smiled for photographs, but something fundamental had shifted. The pretense was gone. They both knew what this was now. A transaction, an arrangement. Frank provided luxury and security. Julie provided image and legitimacy. Love had died quietly, not with drama or betrayal or screaming fights, just with a question Frank couldn't answer. Julie stopped waiting up at night, stopped wondering where Frank was or what he was doing, stopped caring in the way you stop caring when you've accepted that caring changes nothing. She developed her own life within the life. Shopping became more strategic. She built friendships with other women who understood the unspoken rules. She created routines that filled the hours. She became very good at being Frank Lucas's wife. Because once you stop fighting what you are, you can become excellent at it. When the FBI raided their house in 1975, Julie wasn't surprised. She'd known this was coming. You don't live the way they lived without consequences. The question was never if, only when. They arrested Frank in front of her, put him in handcuffs in their living room, the same living room where Julie had asked her question 5 years earlier. An FBI agent asked Julie what she knew about Frank's operation. She looked at him and said, "Honestly, I know my husband is a successful businessman. Beyond that, I don't ask questions." It was true. She genuinely didn't know the details. Frank had kept her separated from the actual work, protected her, or protected himself, probably both. Frank went to prison. 70 years reduced to 15 through cooperation. Julie visited occasionally, not out of devotion, out of habit, because after all those years, she didn't know how to not be Frank Lucas's wife. They divorced eventually, quietly. No drama, just paperwork acknowledging what had been true for years. They were legally bound but emotionally separate. The divorce just made it official. Julie rebuilt her life, slower than she would have liked, because after spending so many years as someone's symbol, finding yourself again takes time. She never remarried, dated occasionally. But she'd learned something in those years with Frank. It's possible to be married and completely alone. And once you've learned that, you're more careful about who you let close. In interviews later, when people asked about Frank, Julie was always diplomatic. "He was a complicated man. Our life together was complicated." She never told the full story, never mentioned the question she'd asked at 4 a.m. on a March night in 1970. That was hers, private, the moment she'd stopped disappearing and started seeing clearly. Frank Lucas died in 2019. Julie heard about it on the news like everyone else, felt something, not grief exactly, not relief, just recognition, a chapter closing that had really closed decades ago. In the days after his death, reporters called asking for comments, memories, stories about the legendary Frank Lucas and his wife. Julie kept it simple. "He was my husband. We built a life together. It wasn't always the life I expected, but it was the life we had." What she didn't say, that life had cost her herself, that she'd spent years being beautiful and expensive and empty, that she'd asked one question that should have ended everything but instead just clarified it. "Do you still see me when you look at me, or do you just see what I cost you?" Frank never answered, not that night, not in all the years that followed. The silence was the answer. He'd stopped seeing Julie, started seeing proof. And once that transformation happens, there's no going back. You can't unsee someone as a symbol and see them as a person again. That's the real story of Julie Lucas, not the furs or the diamonds or the beautiful houses, but the slow disappearance of a woman who became her husband's evidence of success, who asked one question that exposed a truth neither of them could fix. She survived it. Rebuilt, found herself again on the other side, but there were years lost in the middle, years of being seen but not known, valued but not loved, present but not really there. The question she asked Frank that night was really the question she was asking herself. Do I still exist? Or did I become the thing he needed me to be and lose myself completely in the process? It took decades to find the answer, but she found it. Julie Lucas still existed. She'd just been buried under layers of luxury and expectation and performance. And once she remembered who she was, not Frank's wife, not the woman in the diamonds, but Julie, she never let herself disappear again. That was her real empire, not built on money or power or fear, built on the simple, radical act of seeing herself clearly. Of refusing to be a symbol, of asking the one question that changed everything, even if the answer was silence. Frank Lucas built an empire in Harlem. Julie Lucas built something harder. She rebuilt herself after being erased by someone else's ambition. Both empires required sacrifice, but only one was worth it.